Most love stories start with a choice. This one didn't. Nobody asked Elias Cutter if he wanted a widow with 3 kids, a burned-down homestead, and a grief so heavy it had its own weather. Nobody asked me running waiter if she wanted to be handed to a stranger like a problem that needed solving. The Apache way of things and the white man's law had both failed her, and somewhere in the middle of that failure, a rancher with cracked knuckles and a ledger book he talked to more than people got assigned a life he never planned for. What happened next isn't the kind of story that ends with a wedding or a sunset. It's the kind that ends with a man sitting by a fire, years later, finally understanding that the best things that ever entered his life came through doors he never opened himself. Stay with it, it earns every word. I keep a ledger. Most ranchers use ledgers for cattle counts and feed costs and the price of winter hay. Mine has all that, sure columns of numbers going back 11 years, every debt paid and every debt owed written in the same scratchy hand. But I also write other things in it. Notes to myself. Observations. Things that don't belong anywhere else. My father thought it was a strange habit for a grown man. My mother would have understood it. She used to say that a person who doesn't write things down ends up carrying everything in their chest until it breaks them. I've been carrying a lot lately. The entry I wrote on the night of April 14th, 1889, reads as follows. Took in the running waiter woman and her children today, 3 of them, didn't sleep. Don't know what I'm supposed to do with any of this. That's all I wrote, 11 words. For a man who fills half a page describing a difficult cattle crossing, 11 words tells you exactly how undone I was. Let me back up. My name is Elias Cutter. I run a cattle operation outside of Cimarron, New Mexico, about 30 miles from the nearest town with a proper general store. 42 years old. Never married. Not because I didn't want to be, I want to be clear about that, but because the ranch ate every hour I had, and women with good sense don't tend to wait around for a man who falls asleep at the supper table 3 nights out of 7. I knew the running waiters by reputation more than anything else. Her husband, Thomas, half Apache, half something else nobody asked about, had worked the eastern fence line for the Delacroix outfit for 6 years. Good worker, quiet man, the kind who showed up before sunrise and left after dark and never made himself a bother to anyone. His wife, me, was full Apache, from a family that had been ranging these territories before anyone drew lines on maps and called them counties. They had 3 children, Gabriel, who was 9, Lucia, who was 6, a baby named Soto, who was barely walking. Thomas running waiter died in March of a fence post accident that left him with a broken rib that pierced inward. He was gone in 4 days. By the time word reached anyone who might have helped, there wasn't anything left to help with except the aftermath. The aftermath was me and 3 children and a half-finished homestead 12 miles from the Delacroix property, with no title to the land, no legal claim to anything, and a territorial government that moved slower than January mud when it came to the families of mixed-blood workers. I found out about all of this through Chester Hollies, who was the closest thing Cimarron had to a circuit judge, and also the closest thing I had to someone who owed me a favor. Chester came to my ranch on a Tuesday. He sat at my kitchen table and drank my coffee and told me about me running waiter's situation in the careful, measured way that men use when they're about to ask you for something unreasonable. She needs a situation, he said. The children need a roof. That's a shame, I said. It surely is. He looked at me over his coffee cup. Elias. Chester. You've got 4 empty rooms in this house. I set down my cup, very deliberately, the way a man sets down a cup when he's trying not to say something he'll regret. I'm a bachelor, I said. I'm not a charity. Nobody's asking you to be a charity. The Delacroix estate is willing to pay room and board for 6 months. After that, she can work the house if she's willing and you'd pay her a fair wage. It's an arrangement, that's all. An arrangement, I repeated. She doesn't want this any more than you do, Chester said. Then quieter, she asked me specifically to tell you that. I don't know why that detail landed the way it did, but it did. I wrote the word yes in my ledger that night before I'd even fully decided, like my hand knew something my head hadn't caught up to yet. They arrived on a Thursday morning, just after the spring mud had dried enough to make the road passable. I was at the fence line when Chester's wagon came up the long approach, so I had about 3 minutes to stand there and watch them come and feel absolutely nothing useful. The wagon stopped. Chester climbed down. Then a woman climbed down, carefully, without help, with the practiced caution of someone who'd learned not to reach for hands that might not be there. Me running waiter was not what I'd pictured. I don't know what I'd pictured. Something more visibly broken, maybe. Something easier to categorize as needing help. She was tall for a woman. Dark hair pulled back in a single braid that fell past her shoulder. She wore a dark blue dress that had been mended at the collar and both cuffs, mended well, with careful stitching. She carried the baby on her hip like it was the most natural weight in the world. The older boy, Gabriel, walked slightly in front of her, not leading exactly, but positioned in the way that boys position themselves when they've decided they're the man of something now, and the responsibility is making them walk wrong. Lucia held onto the back of her mother's dress with both fists. I walked toward them from the fence line, and I remember thinking, these are not small lives. This is not a small thing Chester has done here. Me running waiter looked at me when I got close enough. Her eyes were dark and completely unreadable, and she held my gaze for exactly as long as she needed to, and not 1 second more. "Mr. Cutter," she said. "Mrs. Running Waiter," I said. That was the entirety of our introduction. The first week was the strangest of my life, and I spent a winter once snowed in for 11 days with a one-eyed mule and a Bible I'd already read twice. Me said almost nothing. She moved through my house like she was calculating something, measuring angles, identifying exits, figuring out what things cost and what things meant. She took the 2 rooms at the back end of the hall, and she fed her children, and she appeared at meals without being summoned and disappeared after them without lingering. She didn't ask me for anything. She didn't thank me for anything. She treated the house like a place she was enduring, not inhabiting. That was fine. I understood enduring. What I didn't understand was Gabriel. The boy was a problem. Not a bad problem, not a cruel or destructive one, but a relentless one. He followed me. Not obviously, not the way a puppy follows. More like the way a hawk circles, wide arcs, keeping distance, always oriented. I'd be mending tack in the barn, and I'd look up, and there he'd be, sitting on the fence rail 30 feet away, looking in a different direction entirely, but clearly tracking every move I made. On the 5th day, I finally said, "You can come closer if you want." He didn't move. "Or you can stay there, suit yourself." He stayed there for another hour. On the 6th day, he was 10 feet closer. On the 7th, he was inside the barn, examining my tools with the focused attention of a boy who has been told his whole life that men and their tools are serious things, and is now deciding what he thinks about that for himself. I handed him a spare brush and pointed at the gray mare. He knew what to do. He'd grown up around horses. We worked in silence for 40 minutes. At the end of it, he said, without looking up from the mare's flank, "My father had a ledger too." I looked at him. "He kept it under the floorboard," Gabriel said. "Mama still has it." I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be either too much or too little. "She reads it sometimes," he said, "at night." He handed me back the brush and went back to the house. I stood in my barn for a long time after that, listening to the horses breathe. Then I opened my ledger and wrote, "The boy's name is Gabriel. He is 9 years old, and he already knows how to carry grief quietly. I don't know what that costs a child." The thing that changed the first week into something different happened on a Sunday. I'd been up since before light with a sick calf. Nothing serious. Just the kind of middle-of-the-night livestock drama that makes you question every choice that led you to a life with animals. By Sunday noon, I was running on maybe 3 hours of sleep and a bad temper, and I came in from the barn wanting nothing except coffee and quiet. What I found was Lucia standing in my kitchen, completely alone, trying to reach the shelf where I kept the cast iron skillet. She was 6 years old and the shelf was at my chest height. She dragged a chair over and was standing on it and still couldn't quite get there. "Where's your mother?" I asked. Lucia looked at me. She had her mother's composure, somehow that same quality of not being rattled by things. "Feeding Sodo," she said. "I'm making breakfast." "You're making breakfast?" "Mama's tired," she said it simply, without drama, the way children say things that are enormous when they've been carrying them long enough that they've stopped feeling enormous. "She didn't sleep. She doesn't sleep good here yet." I got the skillet down. I handed it to her. Then, because I wasn't sure what else to do, I sat at my own kitchen table, and I watched a 6-year-old girl make hotcakes from memory, measuring nothing, adding a pinch of this and a pour of that with the confidence of someone who had been doing it long enough to own the knowledge in her hands. She didn't make them perfectly. The first 2 were too thick and slightly burned on one side. She made a face at them. Then she squared her little shoulders and made 3 more that were considerably better. When Me came in 20 minutes later with the baby on her hip and found her daughter serving hot cakes and a strange rancher, sitting quietly at the table watching with an expression he probably couldn't have described, something shifted in her face. Just for a second. She didn't smile. But something underneath the careful blankness moved. "Lucia," she said. "They're good," Lucia said. "Mr. Cutter is eating them." I was, in fact, eating them. The burned ones, specifically, which I'd taken without thinking. Me sat down across from me. She put Sodo in her lap. She accepted the plate Lucia put in front of her. We ate breakfast together for the first time. It was the loudest quiet I've ever sat inside of. That night I wrote in my ledger for a long time. Not numbers, not cattle counts. I wrote, "I have been alone on this ranch for 9 years. I thought I knew what alone meant. I'm beginning to think I had no idea. There is a difference between a house with 1 person in it and a house with 4 people in it who are all still somehow each completely alone. I don't know what to do with that difference yet, but I think I need to figure it out." I sat with that for a while. Then I wrote 1 more line. "She didn't sleep. She doesn't sleep good here yet." The word "yet" is doing a lot of work in what a 6-year-old just told me, and I'm not sure I'm ready for what it means. By the 3rd week, I had developed the habit of checking whether the lamp in the back hallway was still lit before I went to bed. I told myself it was practical, fire safety, the responsible oversight of a man who owned a wooden structure full of children and kerosene. That's what I told myself. The ledger tells a different story. The ledger says, "Check the hall light again. Still on. She's awake. Has been past midnight 3 times this week." You can tell a lot about what you're actually doing by what you write at midnight. The arrangement, as Chester had framed it, was strictly domestic. Room, board, 6 months of coverage from the Delacroix estate, after which Me would take on housekeeping in exchange for wages and continued shelter. Clean. Defined. The kind of setup that had clear edges which I'd always preferred in my dealings. Give me a fence line over an open range any day. I like to know where things end. What nobody had arranged was any of the human business. Nobody had arranged what to do when Gabriel started showing up at the barn at 5 in the morning, not because I'd asked him to, but because he'd decided on his own that he wanted to learn the morning routine. Nobody had arranged what to do when Lucia began leaving small things on my workbench. A flat stone she'd found, a piece of twisted juniper bark, a dried flower she'd pressed between 2 boards with the seriousness of someone submitting documentation. Nobody had arranged what to do about Sodo, who by the 5th week had decided that my left boot was the funniest object in the world and would crawl toward it with determined focus every time I sat at the table, grab it, and look up at me with an expression of pure triumph. Nobody had arranged what to do about me. She started talking to me at the end of the 3rd week, not about personal things, not yet, practical things. The garden on the south side of the house that had gone to weeds because I had no use for a garden and even less time for one. She asked if she could work it. I said of course. She didn't say thank you. She just started working it the next morning, and by the end of the week there were rows taking shape that I couldn't identify but that smelled, when the afternoon wind moved through them, like something green and purposeful. Then she started asking me things at supper. Where did I get my cattle? What was the winter feed situation? How far was the nearest Apache family she could visit? That last one surprised me, the directness of it. I told her there was a family called Cowboy about 8 miles northeast, on the edge of the Morno Valley. She nodded like she'd already guessed as much, and was just confirming what she knew. She went to see them the following Saturday. She walked 8 miles there and back with Soto on her back and Lucia holding her hand and Gabriel ranging ahead. She was back before dark. She didn't tell me what happened, but something in her had shifted. Some wound that had been held very tightly had been allowed, just slightly, to breathe. I wrote in my ledger, she went to see the Tseye family today. When she came back she put wildflowers in the jar on the kitchen windowsill. It's the first time she's changed anything in this house like she had a right to. I think that matters. I'm not sure how, but I think it does. The trouble with Gabriel happened in the 4th week, and it was my fault. I want to be clear about that. I've been clear about it to myself for years, and I'm being clear about it here. What happened was my fault. We'd been working the fence line together, me and Gabriel, because he'd gotten good enough with the post digger that having him along actually saved me time, and because I'd started to like having him there in the way you start to like a particular sound, without quite meaning to. He worked quietly, and he didn't need to be told the same thing twice, and he asked questions that were precise and never stupid. We'd stopped for water, and I was reviewing the next section of fencing in my head, running the numbers on post spacing, and I said, without thinking, the way you talk to yourself when there's someone else nearby, I said. About 40 more posts ought to do it. That's 3 days of work if the ground doesn't freeze up again. And Gabriel said, my father could do it in 2. He said it simply, no challenge in it, just information, a 9-year-old offering what he knew. I said I work alone. The words were out before I understood what I was doing with them. I wasn't angry. I wasn't dismissing him. I was tired and calculating, and not paying attention to the human being standing next to me. And what came out was the reflex of a man who had told himself for 9 years that working alone was a neutral fact and not a wound. Gabriel didn't say anything. He picked up his side of the wire spool and kept walking. He didn't come to the barn the next morning, or the morning after that. I noticed the absence in the way you notice when a sound you'd gotten used to stops, not immediately, but with a delay, and then with a fullness that surprises you. On the 3rd morning I went and knocked on the door of the back rooms. Me opened it. She looked at me with those unreadable eyes and waited. I said something to Gabriel, I said, out at the fence line. I wasn't thinking, and it came out wrong. She didn't say anything. I'd like to apologize to him, if he wants to hear it. She held my gaze for a long moment, then she stepped back from the door. Gabriel was sitting on the bed, mending one of Lucia's shoes with a needle and thread that was slightly too thick for the work. He was doing it anyway. He looked up. I sat on the floor, there was nowhere else to sit, and I said, I told you I work alone. That wasn't the truth. The truth is I got used to working alone because I didn't know how to let anyone in. That's different. I'm sorry I took that out on you. Gabriel looked at the shoe. Then he said, My father said that sometimes the words men use to protect themselves hurt the people standing next to them. I sat with that for a while. Your father was right, I said. Gabriel nodded, not forgiving me exactly, processing, the way serious people process things before they decide. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, I said. The harder thing happened at the end of the 5th week. There had been a man in town, Deacon Price, who ran the feed supply and had opinions about everything, including the territorial proper use of land and the appropriate behavior of Apache women in white settlements. He'd said things to me when she went into Cimarron for supplies. What exactly he'd said, she didn't tell me, but she came back with a quality in her silence that was different from her usual silence. This was the silence of someone suppressing something hot. I found out from Chester what was said. I went to the feed supply the next morning. What happened there I won't detail entirely, but I want to be honest about one thing. I went there intending to be measured, to be civil, to use words the way a man of standing uses them, as a fence rather than a weapon. I was not measured. I was not civil. I used words the way a man uses them when something that isn't supposed to matter to him has gotten inside the place where things matter. Chester heard about it and told me I'd made an enemy. I told Chester that some enemies were worth making. He looked at me for a long time and said, "Elias, be careful what you're doing here." "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm running an arrangement." "An arrangement," he repeated, the same way I'd repeated it when he'd first said it. Like he was checking the weight of the word. I went home. I didn't tell me what I'd done. I didn't expect anything from it. What happened was, she knew anyway. She found out the way women in small territories always find out, through the particular network of information that moves faster than men realize. She didn't say anything to me about it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, she put a cup of coffee on my workbench while I was working tack. She didn't say anything, just set it there and started to go. "You didn't have to do that," I said, meaning the coffee. She stopped. She turned around halfway. "No," she said, "I didn't." And she went back inside. I sat with that cup of coffee for a long time. I wrote in my ledger, "She left coffee on my bench today." I keep trying to make that into nothing, and it won't cooperate. What I haven't written about yet, because it's the hardest part to write about, is the night of the 5th week when I woke up at 2 in the morning to the sound of crying that was being very carefully suppressed. I lay in bed and listened to it, the specific texture of grief that has been trained to take up as little space as possible, grief that has learned to apologize for itself, to muffle itself in blankets, to stay small. I didn't go knock on the door. I almost did. 3 times I almost did. I didn't because I understood, somewhere in the part of me that has always understood things before I could put words to them, that what me needed in that moment was not to be witnessed. Not yet. She was in a house that didn't belong to her, with a man she didn't know, and the only thing she had left that was entirely hers was the privacy of her grief. I couldn't take that from her. So I lay there. I listened until the sound stopped. Then I lay there some more in the particular silence that follows. In the morning, I was already at the barn by the time she came out. She looked at me across the distance of the yard with that measuring look. I just nodded. She nodded back. That was all, but it was something. I wrote in my ledger at the end of the 5th week. I am beginning to understand that there are forms of respect that don't involve saying anything or doing anything. That sometimes the most decent thing a person can offer is to leave a space untouched. I didn't know that before. I'm not sure I was capable of knowing it before. I'm not sure what that says about who I was for the first 42 years of my life. I underlined the last sentence, then I turned the page. By the end of the 2nd month, the Delacroix money had been received and logged and set aside, and I had stopped thinking of it as the thing that was keeping me and her children in my house. I noticed when that stopped. I wrote about it. The ledger entry reads, "Received the Delacroix payment today, put it in the tin. Did not think about it again. This is probably something I should examine." There is a slow kind of change that happens when you are not looking for it and not braced against it and not even particularly thinking about it. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with any particular feeling. You just look up one day and realize that the furniture of your life has rearranged itself, and you don't remember helping with that. The garden on the south side was growing. Me had put in corn and squash and something else I didn't recognize low to the ground, that she called by an Apache name I wrote down phonetically in my ledger and probably misspelled. She told me it was medicinal. She told me nothing else about it, which I took as her establishing that some things were not available for questions, and I respected that. Gabriel had, by my unofficial count, become a better morning rancher than 2 of the 3 men I'd hired over the past decade. He had the instinct for it, that quality of moving through animal spaces with neither aggression nor fear, just presence. Horses especially. The gray mare that had taken 6 months to trust me had started nuzzling Gabriel's shoulder within 2 weeks. I mentioned this to me one evening and she said, without looking up from her mending, "His grandfather had that with horses. His grandfather's grandfather too." It was the first time she'd mentioned Thomas's family. I understood it was not an invitation to ask more. Lucia continued leaving things on my workbench. The collection had grown. A white feather, 2 more stones, a piece of copper wire bent into the shape of something that might have been a bird, a small sketch on brown paper of what appeared to be the ranch from the south gate. She had talent. The lines were sure for a child of 6. Soto had learned to walk in my kitchen. I was there when it happened. He pulled himself up on my chair leg and stood for a moment, concentrating with the absolute gravity of someone attempting something historic, and then took 3 steps before sitting down hard with an expression of complete surprise. Lucia screamed with delight. Gabriel made a sound that was trying not to be as happy as it was. Me crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and picked him up and held him, and for a moment, just a moment, her face was completely unguarded. I looked away. Some things aren't mine to see. But I'll be honest, it's in the ledger. So to walk today 3 steps. Whatever I am supposed to feel about a thing like that, I felt it. The thing that broke open the careful arrangement happened at the start of the 3rd month, and it came, like most real things, from a direction I wasn't watching. A man named Hargrove came to my property. He represented some Eastern interest, a land consolidation outfit that had been buying up territorial claims around Cimarron, mostly through the kind of legal pressure that isn't technically illegal, but sits very close to the line. He came with papers that he implied made my situation complicated. I won't detail the legal particulars. They weren't as serious as he made them sound, and Chester later confirmed that, but Hargrove also said something, while he was standing on my porch with his papers, that he said the way men like that say things, just casually enough that it can't be called a threat. He said, "You know the territorial office has questions about who's living here. Mixed situation. Could complicate your title claim." He said mixed situation the way that men who have done this before say it, making the accusation without technically making it, making you understand the shape of what they're threatening, without giving you the words to fight back with. I told him to get off my porch. He left. Slowly, the way men leave when they want you to understand they're choosing to leave. I went inside. Me was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had heard. I looked at her, she looked at me. "This will keep happening," she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even particularly said with bitterness. Just a statement of fact, the kind that people who have had to be very clear-eyed about their situations make. "Maybe," I said. "Because of us." "Because of people like him," I said, "not because of you." She studied me. That measuring look that I had by now learned was not coldness but assessment. Me evaluating whether something was true or whether it was the kind of comfortable thing men say that doesn't survive contact with reality. I can find another arrangement, she said. If this becomes... Don't, I said. She waited. Don't, I said again. This is your home. The kids, this is their home. I'm not letting some Eastern paper pusher make decisions about who belongs on my land. The word home sat there between us. I hadn't planned to use it. I hadn't even known I thought it. Me didn't say anything, but something in her face did something, a careful release, like a door being opened from the inside. The conversation that changed everything happened 3 weeks after that. It was evening. Gabriel and Lucia were asleep. Soto was down. Me and I had both just ended up at the kitchen table, not by design, just by the gravity of habit, with coffee going cold between us. She said, "Tell me about your mother." I looked up. "You write about her," me said. "In the ledger. Twice I've seen you write something and I could tell from your face it was about her." I hadn't known she'd seen that. I thought about being bothered by it. I wasn't. "She died when I was 14, I said. "Fever, it came fast." Me nodded. "She was the one who told me to write things down," I said. "She said if you don't write things down you end up carrying everything in your chest until it breaks you." Me looked at her coffee cup. "My grandmother said something like that, different words, same thing." We sat with that for a while. Then she said, without looking up, "Thomas kept a ledger too. I told you Gabriel said that." "Gabriel told me," I said. "Yes." "I still read it," she said. "I know I said that, or Gabriel did." A pause. "Some nights it's the only way I know how to talk to him." I didn't say anything. This was one of those moments that I'd learned, slowly and with difficulty, to hold still inside of. "He would have liked you," she said, quietly, looking at the table. "Not at first. He needed time with people, but once he decided," she looked up, "he would have liked you." I had to work at keeping my face neutral. I didn't entirely succeed. "I think I would have liked him," I said. She nodded. Then she said, "I don't know what this is." "Neither do I said. "I'm not ready for it to be anything," she said. "Clear. Honest. The kind of honesty that isn't cruelty but is the most respectful thing a person can offer when the other person actually deserves their honesty." "I know," I said. "But I don't want to leave," she said. "I want you to know that, whatever else is true." "Then don't," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she stood up, took her coffee cup to the counter and went to bed. I sat at the table for a long time after. The lamp was burning low. Outside, the New Mexico dark was doing what it always does in late spring, getting so quiet that you can hear things you can't usually hear, the particular sounds of the land settling into itself. I opened my ledger. I wrote, "She said she doesn't want to leave. I've been running a ranch alone for 9 years. I've been alone in this house for 9 years, and I called it preference, and I called it practicality, and I called it simplicity, and I'm sitting here now understanding that every single one of those words was a lie I told myself, because the truth was too much to look at directly. The truth is I didn't know how to want anything I didn't already have." I stopped. Then I wrote, "She said Thomas would have liked me. I think what that cost her to say is something I'm going to spend a long time trying to be worthy of." The months that followed are not mine to describe in detail. What I can say is that they were the most honest months of my life. Me started teaching Lucia Apache words in the evenings, sitting on the porch with the last of the daylight, and sometimes Gabriel and I would be near enough to hear them. The words had a music to them that I couldn't enter but could stand near. I got used to standing near things I couldn't fully have. I taught Gabriel to read the cattle conditions, the small signs in an animal's gait and coat that tell you what's coming before the animal shows any obvious distress. He was better at it than I'd been at his age. I told him that. He didn't respond the way a child who has been praised a lot responds. He just got a slightly more concentrated look on his face and went back to watching the cattle, like the information was something to use rather than to feel good about. Sodo began calling me something, not a name, a sound, a particular syllable that he deployed specifically when I was in the room, like an identifier. Me heard it one morning and went very still. Then she went back to what she was doing and didn't say anything. I wrote about it. Of course I wrote about it. I wrote, "The baby has a sound for me. Just me. Nobody else in the house gets this sound." I told this to the ledger instead of to me because I don't have the first idea what to do with it, but I know that somewhere in my chest this sound is doing something structural. At the end of the 6th month, Chester came back. He sat at my kitchen table again. He drank my coffee again. He reviewed the Delacroix arrangement and said the 6 months were up and asked how I wanted to proceed. I told him that I was paying me a fair wage for housekeeping, same as I'd pay any capable person in the same position. I told him she and the children were staying. I told him the Delacroix money could be returned if they wanted it back. Chester looked at me for a long moment. "Elias," he said. "Don't," I said. "I'm just going to say." "Chester." He stopped. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has known you long enough to know the difference between when you're being stubborn and when you've made a decision. "All right," he said. After he left, I found me in the garden. She'd heard the conversation through the window. The kitchen window was always open in warm weather. She didn't look up from what she was doing with the plants. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," I said. She was quiet for a moment, working. "Elias," she said, first time she'd used my name without the mister. I noticed. I'm sure she knew I'd notice. "Yes," I said. She looked up. She didn't say anything else, but she held my eyes for long enough that I understood something had been decided or begun, or I don't know. I'm a man who keeps a ledger, not a man who has the right words for everything. Some things you write down. Some things you just stand inside of and let them be what they are. I'll finish here. Not because the story ended. It didn't, not then, not in any clean way, but because the part I've been trying to describe has its edges here, and I've learned slowly that a man shouldn't write past his edges. What I'll say is this. I was given a widow I never asked for, 3 children I never asked for, a garden that smells like something green and purposeful, a gray mare that now belongs more to a 9-year-old boy than to me, if I'm honest, a collection of stones and feathers and one small copper wire bird on my workbench, a baby with a specific syllable that means something I don't have a word for yet. My ledger has 4 full volumes now, where there used to be 1. My chest is full. It does not feel like breaking.